sua aceitação. Mas o samba brasileiro já nasce no coração, já nasce no coração. Tu que una vez me quisiste y a mí me dijiste te quiero a ti.
A natural thing to think, if we look at this overdetermination in the concrete cases, this overdetermination of facts, would be to say that a dialethia can exist only insofar as both independent facts determinately exist. And but you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that this is not mandatory, and in fact that you may claim that one or both of these facts both exist and do not exist. So I would like you to discuss in general the phenomenon of existential dialethias. I'm wondering, okay, so in the case of constructive entities, entities that can be referred to only by description, it seems pretty clear what we are talking about. If you introduce a contradictory description, well, then it makes sense to claim that an entity both exists and doesn't exist, Russell's set or whatever. But in the case, do you think this applies also to concrete entities? And if so, do you think that the possibility of a concrete, contingent, existential dialethias is confined to the case where we don't have acquaintance, but only a description of the presumed entity? Or do you think that you can even directly refer to an entity and of that entity claim that it both exists and doesn't exist?
Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting question. So we're talking about dialethias of the form so-and-so exists, where so-and-so is a concrete object. Okay. In principle, I see no reason why there cannot be such things. Of course, examples are going to be contentious, but let me give you one. This involves a paradox we haven't, I don't think, talked about, which is the Sorites Paradox. Have we talked about the Sorites Paradox?
No, not in any detail.
Okay. So
this could be a good time to do it.
All right. So let me explain what a Sorites paradox is, and then we'll come back to existence. Sorites paradoxes arise when predicates are kind of vague in a certain sense, or at least they have a certain tolerance. So if you're a child, a biological child, then you're still a biological child 1 nanosecond later. Okay. So adding 1 nanosecond does not change your status as a child. Or suppose you're sober and you consume 1 cc of alcohol, you're still going to be sober, right? So this tolerance principle gives rise to conclusions, or appears to give rise to conclusions which no one can accept. So you get up in the morning, you haven't had a drink, you're stone cold sober, right? And you drink 1 cc of alcohol. Well, because you're sober and you've had 1 cc of alcohol, you're still sober. Then you have another cc of alcohol. You were sober, drinking 1 cc of alcohol preserves the property of being sober. Okay, so you can see how we're going. So you keep consuming 1 cc of alcohol. Whenever, before you consume it, you're sober. Consuming 1 cc doesn't change that. So you keep on going. And after you've had, 5 or 6 liters of vodka, you're still sober. Now that's crazy, okay? And no dialethius is going to say, well, you're sober and not sober after 5 liters of vodka. Okay, now, how you solve the liar paradox is a highly contentious. and topical discussion in philosophy of logic. There are many possible solutions. They all have problems, but a natural thought is that in this transition from being sober to being blind drunk, there's a kind of borderline area where you're as sober as drunk as sober. So in other words, if you take a look at the claim, you're drunk, applying to that borderline area, it seems to be as true as false and as false as true. Now, there are only two symmetric possibilities, that it's neither true nor false, or both true or false. And those two possibilities define two approaches to solutions to the line paradox. Not the only ones by any means, but there are those two solutions. The gap solution, the neither true nor false, is probably more commonly endorsed just because people don't like dialetheism. But in terms of symmetry, they're both equally symmetrical. So suppose you do endorse a dialethic account of the Sorites, and in particular what happens in this transition area, then so-and-so is drunk is going to be both true and false in this transition area. If you want to make this more sort of visualizable, you can run a Sorites with colors. So suppose you've got a color spectrum, as it were, which goes from sort of blood red at one end to navy blue at the other, in very, 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 very gradually. Okay. And you can cut this up into a lot of little strips such that each strip is perceptually identical with the adjacent strips. So you've got this principle of tolerance. If this strip is red, then the strip next to it is perceptually indistinguishable, so it's going to be red. So you've got this Sorites problem, and if you look at the color somewhere in the middle, you're going to say, well, is it red or is it not red? Is it blue? Is it not blue? And you're likely to say, well, it's kind of neither or both or whatever. Again, what you say will depend on, whether you think the gap or the glut is appropriate. Okay, so that's the background on the Sorites. Now let's come back to your question about the existence. Much as this might not have occurred to people, existence comes by degrees. So people don't die instantaneously. Their life support processes, gradually fade out. It might take minutes, it might take hours. Even if you're blown up by an explosion, which is a kind of rather sudden and violent way to end, it takes time for your parts to be torn apart. Okay, it might be 10 to the minus 10 seconds, but nonetheless, it takes time. Okay, and if it takes time, whether you're alive or dead is going to be this vague in this transition area. You might also think, incidentally, that the same happens at the other end of life. I mean, certain views hold that a person comes into existence at conception. Although even conception takes time. It takes the sperm. The sperm doesn't get into the ovum instantaneously. But, if you don't hold that a person begins at conception, you're likely to hold that person comes into existence gradually, somewhere between conception and, birth. It's a gradual process. So, existence of people, quite plausibly, starts and ends gradually, and you're going to get a Sorites. If so, if you accept that, and if you accept a dialethic solution to the Sorites, then existence is going to be, there are going to be contradictions concerning concrete entities like people in this borderline area. Now, I haven't tried to argue for a dialectic solution. That's much more contentious. But at least the situation shows you that there seems to be no kind of conceptual impossibility in the thought that an existence claim could be both true and false as well.
O bolero tem cadência para muitos